Arihant-Class Submarine, India's sea-based nuclear deterrent and the strategic transformation of naval power. Introduction: The Arihant-class submarine represents one of the most consequential milestones in the military strategic history of modern India. More than a warship, more than an engineering achievement, and more than a symbol of national pride, the Arihant class is the material expression of India's long pursuit of a survivable, credible, and autonomous nuclear deterrence. In the architecture of great power security, ballistic missile submarines occupy a unique place. They are not built merely to fight wars. They are built to prevent them through the logic of deterrence. A nation that possesses a functioning fleet of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines enter a different category of statecraft. It acquires the capacity to preserve retaliation even after absorbing a devastating first strike. That single reality changes strategic calculation, diplomatic posture, military planning, and the psychology of both allies and adversaries. The Arihant class emerged from a long and secretive process that fused geopolitical shock, technological ambition, bureaucratic persistence, industrial mobilization, and strategic necessity. It was not a quick program, but it was not a cheap one either. It took decades of institutional efforts, repeated redesigns, foreign assistance in selected areas, and the creation of an industrial and scientific ecosystem capable of producing one of the most difficult machines ever built by a state. Nuclear submarines are among the highest expression of national power because they require mastery across multiple domains at once. Metallurgy, reactor design, propulsion engineering, stealth, hydrodynamics, combat systems, missile integration, undersea navigation, crew training, command and control, strategic doctrine could be a few examples. The Arihant class is therefore important not merely because it exists, but because its existence proves the maturation of a broader state capacity. In military terms, the class anchors India's sea-based deterrence; in political terms, it strengthens India's claim to strategic autonomy. In symbolic terms, it marks India's transition from a state dependent primarily on land-based nuclear deterrence to one capable of sustaining a triad of delivery systems. In doctrinal terms, it gives substance to the idea of assured retaliation. In geopolitical terms, it is a part of India's long-term answer to strategic pressure created by China, Pakistan, extra-regional naval powers, and the instability of wider Indo-Pacific. The Arihant-class program must therefore be understood not as an isolated naval procurement project, but as a structural transformation in India's conception of power. The strategic logic of ballistic missile submarines. To understand the Arihant class properly, one must first understand the strategic function of a ballistic missile submarine. A ballistic missile submarine, commonly designated as an SSBN, is not designed primarily for tactical combat at sea. It is designed for strategic deterrence. Unlike conventional submarines, which may be employed for anti-ship warfare, intelligence gathering, denial operations, or sea lane interdiction, an SSBN exists above all to carry nuclear weapons in a concealed, survivable, and continuously deployable form. It is a second strike platform. Its purpose is to make the destruction of a country's nuclear arsenal impossible in a single disarming blow. In nuclear strategy, survivability matters as much as destructive capacity. A land-based missile force can be targeted, air bases can be hit, strategic bombers can be tracked, fixed command infrastructure can be degraded, but a ballistic missile submarine hidden under vast oceanic depths, constantly moving, shielded by uncertainty, and supported by secure communications, is far more difficult to locate and neutralize. That makes it the most credible guarantor of retaliation. Once a country has a reliable SSBN force, any adversary contemplating nuclear first use must reckon with unavoidable retaliation. This is the central reason ballistic missile submarines are regarded as the crown jewel of deterrent stability. For India, the need for such a capability was sharpened by regional realities. It faces two nuclear armed adversaries, one to the west, one to the north. Pakistan presents an immediate, persistent deterrence challenge, while China presents a larger, deeper, and more technologically complex strategic platform. A sea-based deterrent gives India flexibility, survivability, and depth. It also reduces overdependence on land-based systems that could be more vulnerable during crisis. The Arihant class, therefore, is not simply an extension of naval power into the nuclear realm. It is the institutional embodiment of a mature deterrence posture. Historical origins, war, vulnerability, and strategic memory. The roots of the Arihant-class programs lies in the security lessons India drew from the Cold War era, particularly from the 1971 Indo-Pakistan War. During that war, the movement of the United States Navy Task Force 74, led by nuclear-powered USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal, left a durable imprint on Indian strategic thinking. Regardless of the exact operational intentions of the US force, the signal it sent was unmistakable. Extra-regional powers could project military pressure into India's maritime theater during a crisis. For Indian planners, the episode reinforced the harsh truth that diplomatic righteousness without strategic depth is fragile. Power, not sentiment, shapes the operating space of states. The response, including the deployment of a submarine presence in support of India, further underscored another lesson: nuclear armed and nuclear powered maritime assets alter the balance of intimidation. In other words, the event didn't merely dramatize Indian vulnerability, it revealed the strategic value of underwater nuclear capability. That moment persisted. After India's 1974 nuclear test, the idea of developing indigenous nuclear propulsion for naval platforms began to move from an abstraction towards a technical feasibility. This was not yet the mature Arihant class program, but the conceptual foundation had been laid. The program later evolved through the successive steps shaped by political will and strategic circumstances. The 1990s saw the project take more concrete form by the late 1990s after the program's second nuclear test and India's explicit nuclearization. The logic of the project shifted decisively towards the development of ballistic missile submarines rather than a purely nuclear powered attack submarine. That shift was not centered around credible minimal deterrence and no first use. The absence of a survivable sea-based component became more glaring. A triad without a submarine leg is incomplete in both operational and doctrinal terms. Thus, the Arihant class emerged from historical memory and strategic embarrassment, doctrinal maturation, and geopolitical necessity. The program was the product of a long-range state reasoning rather than the result of a single event. This is why it persisted despite delays, secrecy, cost escalation, and technical obstacles. The Advanced Technology Vessel Project and the Culture of Secrecy. The Arihant-class submarines were developed under the Advanced Technology Vessel or ATV project. The title itself was deliberately bland, a bureaucratic disguise for a program of profound strategic significance. Such nomenclature is common in high-security weapons programs because secrecy is not peripheral to them, it is integral. And nuclear submarine projects touches the most sensitive layers of the state: nuclear engineering, strategic doctrine, missile capacity, naval basing, command authority, and long-term deterrence planning. Exposure of detailed design, timelines, and vulnerabilities could create exploitable intelligence for adversaries. As a result, the ATV program evolved as a deeper, classified enterprise rather than under close supervision at the highest political levels. This secrecy had several implications. First, public knowledge of the program lagged far behind its actual development. Second, open source details about cost, specifications, displacements, acoustic performances, reactor characteristics, and missile integration were often fragmented, inconsistent, or based on interference. Third, the program became a test of the Indian state's ability to coordinate across military, scientific, industrial, and political institutions without the usual visibility that accompanies major public sector undertakings. That is important because secrecy can either produce competence or conceal dysfunction. In the Arihant's case, it did both at different times. It shielded the strategic logic of the project from external scrutiny, but it also allowed technical delays and developmental inefficiencies to remain opaque for longer periods. Yet, secrecy also reflects the nature of the object being built. A ballistic missile submarine is not like a fighter aircraft purchased for public display or a destroyer used for visible naval diplomacy. Its strategic value lies precisely in concealment. That state, the state that builds such a platform enters a different operational culture. It must think in terms of hidden patrol patterns, silent-based arrangements, protected communications, compartmentalized informations, failed deadly command architecture, and wartime resilience. The culture of secrecy surrounding the Arihant class was therefore not merely administrative caution. It was an early expression of the broader strategic logic within which such submarines exist. India's quest for an indigenous nuclear submarine capability. Building an indigenous nuclear submarine is one of the most difficult technological undertakings a nation can attempt. It is easy for public discourse to reduce such programs to patriotic slogans, but the actual challenge is brutal. A nuclear submarine is a compressed ecosystem of extreme precision. The reactor must be compact, safe, durable, and quiet. The hull must withstand immense pressure while maintaining acoustic discretion. Propulsion systems must be reliable and stable. Steam generation, turbine integration, shielding, damage control, auxiliary systems, combat information management, sonar, and weapons handling must all function under highly constrained spatial conditions. The crews must be trained to operate a floating nuclear plant underwater in silence under stress for extended period of time. Failure at any level can be catastrophic. India's attempts to master this field required the development of capabilities it didn't fully possess at the outset. That included nuclear reactor miniaturization, specialized hull fabrication, systems integration, undersea weaponization, and suitable base infrastructure. The project involved organizations such as the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research, the Defense Research and Development Organization or the DRDO, naval design elements, and major industrial firms like Larsen and Toubro, Tata Power ACD, and Walchandnagar Industries. This was not a single manufacturer program, it was a state-directed ecosystem project. The significance of this point cannot be overstated. States that build nuclear submarines do not merely assemble a vessel, they create an industrial web of strategic competence. Once such a competence exists, it generates spillover effects in metallurgy, control systems, reactor engineering, marine fabrication, high security project management, and future submarine designs. The Arihant class therefore must be assessed not only by the number of missiles it carries or the tonnage of individual hulls, but by the institutional capacity it cultivated across India's defense industrial complex. At the same time, the road to this capability was neither linear or smooth. India faced bottlenecks in its reactor miniaturization, metallurgy expertise, and hull construction experience. Foreign technical assistance, especially from Russia in selected areas, appears to have played a role in bridging some of these gaps. The Indian Navy's personnel also gained crucial experience through operation and training associated with Russian nuclear submarines such as INS Chakra. This pattern is common in late industrial strategic programs. Autonomy is the objective, but transitional dependence is often unavoidable. The real question is not whether foreign help existed, but whether it was used to build indigenous competence rather than permanent dependency. In the Arihant program, what that appears to have been the broader trajectory. Design philosophy, general characteristics of the Arihant class. The Arihant class consists of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines designed to perform strategic deterrence patrols. The earlier units of the class, especially INS Arihant and INS Arighat, are smaller than many of the SSBNs fielded by long-established nuclear powers. Their surface replacement has been reported by 6,000 tons with a length of roughly 11 with a length of roughly 111 meters and a beam of 11 meters and a draught around 15 meters. Later boats, especially the stretched variants such as Aridaman and the fourth submarine commonly referred as the S-4 are larger, reportedly around 7,000 tons surface and about 130 meters long. This increase in size was not cosmetic; it reflected a strategic redesign to increase missile carrying capacity. The submarines are powered by a compact, pressured water reactor. Open source discussion places the reactor output in the broad range of low hundreds of megawatts thermal and several dozen megawatts electrical, though public numbers may vary. The submarine is driven through a single shaft arrangement and is reported to achieve modest surface speed and significantly higher submerged speed. Its endurance is theoretically limited less by propulsion fuel than by crew endurance, maintenance constraints, and food supplies, which is typical of a nuclear-powered submarine. The class is believed to incorporate a double hull arrangement and a combination of indigenous and foreign-derived design influences. Sonar and combat systems listed in open sources include systems such as USHUS and the Panchandriya, which indicate India's effort to develop a domestic undersea sensor architecture. Armament includes submarine-launched ballistic missiles and conventional torpedo tubes capable of firing torpedoes and potential other payloads, but it would be analytically mistaken to focus too heavily on torpedo room. An SSBN is not measured by the ability to win undersea duels; it is measured by its ability to remain undetected and preserve strategic retaliatory force. The design philosophy of the class appears to have combined ambition with incrementalism. India didn't begin with a giant, heavily armed SSBN equivalent to the largest American or Russian boats. It began with a more limited but transformative platform, learned from that experience and then expanded the design. This is strategically rational. States new to a technology of such complexity often build an initial generation that is less capable than mature foreign analogues, then refine their architecture in subsequent variants. The Arihant class should therefore be seen as both an operational capability and a stepping stone forward more capable future systems, such as the proposed S5 class. The reactor, heart of the deterrent. At the center of every nuclear submarine lies its reactor. The reactor in the Arihant class program was one of the most difficult components to design and validate. Miniaturizing a pressured water reactor for naval use is a distinct challenge from designing large civilian power reactors. A submarine reactor must be compact, robust, and simple and capable of stable output under maritime conditions. It must operate safely in confined spaces, integrate with propulsion systems, and do so while minimizing acoustic signatures. Noise control matters because a loud submarine is a vulnerable submarine. The Indian significant the Indian scientific establishment, particularly BARC and IGCAR, played a central role in developing the naval reactor. A land-based prototype at Kalpakkam was reportedly used to validate the design, test subsystems, and train personnel. This step is critical because submarine nuclear energy allows little room for improvisation. A reactor failure at sea is not a public embarrassment, it is a national catastrophe. Accordingly, the path from laboratory design to operate installation necessarily involve years of testing, incremental validation, and infrastructure development for fuel loading, maintenance, and crew training. The existence of this reactor capability matters strategically in two ways. First, it underpins the Arihant class itself. Without it, the submarine would be impossible. Second, it gives India the basis of future generations of more capable submarines, possibly with improved power, endurance, and performance characteristics. Once a state masters naval reactor design, it gains a double strategic asset not easily replicated by others. This is one reason why nuclear-powered submarine states are few and why entry into that club carries such a prestige. Yet reactor capability alone is insufficient. A submarine reactor that powers a vessel which is too noisy, too limited in missile reach, and too constrained by petrol geography will still reach yield only in terms of partial deterrence value. Thus, the reactor is the heart of the platform, but not entirely of strategic success. It provides endurance and mobility. Whether that endurance translates into credible deterrence depends on missile range, stealth, command and control, and petrol doctrine. Missile armament and the logic of reach. The defining weapon of the Arihant class is the submarine-launched ballistic missile systems. Open source descriptions indicate that the early boats can carry either 12 K5 Sagarika missiles in a multiple per tube configuration or 4 K4 larger launch tubes. Later stretched variants are said to be able to carry 24 K5 or 8 K4 missiles, and future adaptation to longer range missiles such as K5 has been suggested. This evolution reveals much about the strategic maturation of this program. The K-15 provides shorter range deterrence capability. It can hold Pakistani targets at risk from relative proximate waters. This gives the submarine operational relevance in the Western deterrence theaters, but shorter range missiles impose geographic constraints. If a submarine must approach closer to hostile surveillance zones or choke points to achieve target coverage, its survivability declines. Long-range SLBMs are therefore far more valuable for secure deterrence because they allow the submarine to remain in safer bastions while still covering critical enemy targets. The K4 changes the equation by extending reach significantly. With a range around the mid thousands of kilometers in open source reporting, it can cover all of Pakistan and give India greater leverage against portions of China from safer maritime spaces. But even this may not be enough for optimal deterrence against China's full strategic depth. Some analysts have noted that to credible hold certain inland or northern Chinese targets at risk, Indian submarines may need to patrol in more exposed areas unless long-range missiles become fully integrated. That limitation is not trivial. Strategic deterrence is not just about posing missiles, it's about the patrol geometry those missiles permit. This is why the future missile path matters enormously. A more advanced SSBN carrying longer range SLBMs with multiple independently targetable re-entry capability would dramatically strengthen India's second strike capability posture against China. The Arihant class, in that sense, is an important stage rather than the endpoint. It establishes the architecture. Future missile development will determine how complete that architecture becomes. The Arihant stretch and the problem of limited payload. One of the most revealing aspects of the Arihant story is that the shift towards the so-called Arihant stretch design. Early versions of the class were criticized, including reportedly within political and strategic circles, for their limited number of missile launch tubes. This criticism was fundamentally valid. A ballistic missile submarine that carries too few missiles will still continue to deterrence, but its strategic payoff relative to cost becomes questionable. If a platform is difficult and expensive to build, it may justify itself not merely symbolically but in terms of retaliatory capacity. The redesign that added a 10-meter hull section and increased the number of launch tubes reflected a recognition that the first generation, while historic, wasn't optimal. This is how serious military programs evolve, not through slogans but through correction. The stretched boats, including Arihaman and the fourth submarine, are strategically more meaningful because they carry a larger payload. More missiles mean greater target coverage, more flexible warhead distribution, and higher deterrence density per patrol. It also means that a small fleet can still sustain meaningful strategic presence. The existence of this redesign also reveals that the Arihant program was not frozen by its original concept. The Indian strategic system showed willingness to admit, at, in, at least internally, that the first design needed improvement. This is a sign of institutional seriousness. No military program reaches maturity if it is treated as a sacred project immune from criticism. The real mark of a functioning strategic culture is the ability to identify inadequacy and scale capability accordingly. The stretched Arihant design is the evidence of that logic. Construction, industry, and the state strategic manufacturing capacity. The Arihant-class program depended on a dense network of institutions and firms. The shipbuilding sector at Visakhapatnam served as a core assembly and construction site. Larsen and Toubro played a major role in detailed engineering and a hull-related work, including a critical fabrication task. Tata powered ACD contributed control systems, while Chandnagar Industries supported turbine-related systems. State scientific bodies handled reactor designs, testing, and related nuclear engineering. This kind of project cannot be built through fragmented contractor logic alone. It requires integration under strategic direction. That industrial collaboration matters because advanced naval systems are test cases for national manufacturing. Depth. A country that cannot produce specialized steels, precision hull sections, quieting components, high integrity control systems, and reliable reactor subsystems cannot sustain an autonomous undersea deterrent. Importing a few major items is not the same as owning the manufacturing process. The Arihant class therefore illuminates India's industrial ambitions such as much as its military ones. At the same time, the program also revealed the cost of underdevelopment in high-end manufacturing, delays associated with metallurgy, subsystem integration, and other technical constraints such that India's industrial base was capable but uneven. Strategic manufacturing is unforgiving. A civilian industry can sometimes survive inefficiencies through subsidies, low standards, or price insulation. A submarine program cannot. If the intolerance margins are wrong, the vessel fails. Thus, the Arihant class should be understood as both a success and a diagnostic. It proved India could build such submarines, but also exposed the domains in which India still needed deeper industrial competence. Timeline and operational evolution of the class. The timeline of the Arihant class is long because strategic industrial reality is slow. The project's intellectual roots go back to the 1970s. Additional funds were allotted in the 1980s. The first major public confirmation of the project came in the late 1990s. The first steel cutting for the hull occurred in 1998. The lead boat, INS Arihant, was launched in 2009 after decades of hidden effort. Its reactor attained criticality later, and sea trials began in 2014. It was commissioned in August 2016. Only in 2018 did it complete the first reported deterrence patrol, marking the transition from technological demonstrator to strategic assets. The second boat, INS Arighat, followed a similar but protracted path. Launched in 2017 and commissioned in 2024, it reflected both continuity and delay. The third boat, Aridhaman, launched in 21, represents the enlarged subclass and suggests a deliberate transition from proof to concept to improved operational design. The fourth submarine, launched in 2024, reportedly referred to as the S4 or possibly Arisudan in later reporting, indicates that India is moving towards a small but more viable SSBN force structure rather than relying on a single iconic vessel. This timeline tells an important story. The strategic value of an SSBN force doesn't emerge when a hull is floated out of a dry dock. It emerges when submarines complete trial, validate their reactors, test missile systems, integrate crews, undergo deep diving and patrol certification, and then actually sustain deterrent patrols. The gap between launch and operational relevance may be many years. Public discussions often confuse launch with capability. That is sloppy thinking. A submarine exists as a military asset only when it can perform its missions, not when it becomes a ceremonial headline. In that sense, the Arihant program has moved from a symbolic achievement to an early operational maturity. India now appears to have transitioning from possessing one path-breaking SSBN to building a rotational capable class. That matters because deterrent credibility improves sharply when more than one boat is available. A single submarine can be in refit, maintenance, or transit. A class begins to create problems for persistent patrol patterns. INS Arihant, the lead boat and the technology demonstrator. INS Arihant occupies a special place in the Indian naval history because it was the first indigenously developed ballistic missile submarine to enter the service. Its significance, however, lies not only in being first, but in being what first actually meant. The first boat in such a class is rarely the most capable. It is the first platform through which a state confronts the brutal friction between ambition and reality. Arihant served as a technology demonstrator, a training platform, a doctrinal laboratory, and eventually an operational deterrence asset. Its journey from launch in 2009 to its commission in 2016 and deterrent patrol in 2018 underscores the complexity of a nuclear submarine maturation. It had to validate reactor performance, propulsion reality systems, integration, missile ejection, and firing capability. Deep sea endurance and crew readiness. Submarine also had to serve as the platform through which India learned how to maintain, deploy, and command strategic undersea nuclear assets. That institutional learning may be more valuable in the long run than the performance of the individual hull itself. Arihant was therefore a beginning, not a culmination. Its limitations in missile payloads and perhaps in acoustic discretion do not erase its importance, but neither should the symbolism be allowed to obscure those limitations. The lead boat broke the barrier; it didn't solve the entire strategic problem. INS Arihant and the consolidation of capability. INS Arihant, commissioned in 2024, is significant because it demonstrates continuity. One of submarine can be dismissed as prestige. A second operational SSBN class formation. With Arihant, India moved closer to possessing an actual deterrent fleet rather than a single emblem. Even if the second boat remained similar in broad design to the lead vessel, the strategic effect of a second hull is substantial. It improves training cycle, maintenance resilience, operational availability, and confidence in design reproduction. The commission of INS Arihant also showed that India's industrial and naval systems could replicate complex SSBN construction rather than merely complete a single heroic project. Repetition is a harsher test rather than innovation. Many states can build a prototype, far fewer can build a class. Arihant thus matters because it demonstrates that institutional knowledge gained from Arihant wasn't trapped inside a one-time effort. At the doctrinal level, a second submarine is also improved the credibility of sea-based deterrence. Adversaries know that a single submarine is easier to account for in strategic planning. A second complicates uncertainty. It also permits the beginning of rotation, where one platform can be maintained while prepared prepared while the other remains available. This is not equivalent to the large SSBN fleets of major powers, but it is materially more credible than a single-turn system. Aridhaman and the shift towards a more serious SSBN force. The third submarine, Aridhaman, represents a more important leap than a casual observer might assume. It belongs to the enlarged or stretched variants with greater displacement and increased missile carrying capacity. In strategic terms, this makes it more meaningful than a mere addition to the fleet. It suggests that India is moving beyond proof of concept into an improved deterrent architecture. If the enlarged boats indeed carry 8 K4 class missiles or a large complement of a short range missile, they are significantly more useful as strategic assets. Payload matters, especially in a small fleet. A boat carrying a greater number of long range ballistic missiles can represent a more robust retaliatory threat per patrol. It also allows India to achieve more than fewer deployable hulls, which is important while the force remains small. Arithman therefore should be interpreted as the point where Arihant program begins to approximate a more serious SSBN logic. The first boat established capability, the larger boat starts to optimize it, and whether this will be sufficient against China in the long run is another matter. But it is questionably a more mature stage of development. The fourth boat and the transition towards future classes. The fourth submarine launched in 2024 and later reported in open source discussion as possibly being named INS Arisudhan represents the completion of the immediate Arihant-class sequence. If it enters service on projected timelines, India will possess four boats in varying states of operational readiness, enough to begin thinking in terms of force management rather than vessel management. That distinction is critical. A navy with one strategic submarine manages a vessel. A navy with multiple submarines manages a deterrent system. The fourth boat also sits at the threshold between the Arihant class and the future S5 concept. The Arihant class, especially in its enlarged forms, is likely an intermediate solution, an indispensable bridge between zero capability and a more powerful next generation. The S5 concept, discussed in open sources, points towards larger displacement, more launch tubes, and longer range missile capacity. If realized, that would address many of the limitations associated with current class, especially in relations to China. Thus, the fourth Arihant class boat should be seen not as the final member of its class, but as the final operational schoolhouse before India attempts a more advanced undersea strategic force. Strengths of the Arihant class. The strength of the Arihant class are real and substantial. First, it gives India a functioning sea-based nuclear deterrence. That is clear fact, and it matters more than any criticism. Once a state fields an operational SSBN and integrates into a deterrent patrol patterns, it crosses a strategic threshold. Second, the class anchors SSBN nuclear triad. This improves survivability, doctrinal coherence, and crisis stability. Third, the program has generated indigenous expertise in naval reactor technology, submarine design, and missile integration, as well as strategic industrial manufacturing. These are durable national assets that outlast individual hulls. Fourth, the Arihant class enhances India's strategic autonomy. A state that preserves retaliation from sea is less vulnerable to coercion and less dependent on visible or fixed strategic assets. Fifth, the program has strong symbolic value in the realm of international status. While symbolism alone is useless in war, it is not irrelevant in statecraft. States are judged partly by the complexity of systems they can design, build, and operate. Nuclear submarines are enormous prestige because they are extraordinarily difficult to master. Finally, the class establishes a learning curve. Even if the early boats are limited compared with matured foreign SSBNs, the knowledge gained from these operations is invaluable. Undersea deterrence is not a static technological prowess. It is a disciplined learning through repeated patrols, maintenance cycles, command exercise, crew culture, and gradual doctrinal enforcement. Limitations and criticisms. The Arihant class is important, but is not beyond criticism. Open source discussions have often pointed to acoustic limitations, implying that the boats may be noisier than ideal. If true, this would be a serious strategic weakness. The value of SSBNs rests heavily on stealth. A submarine that can reliably track in wartime is not a secure second strike platform, even the partial acoustic inferiority matters, especially against advanced anti-submarine warfare networks. A second limitation concerns missile ranges. The K-15 is useful mainly against near targets, particularly Pakistan. The K5 extends reach significantly but may still leave gaps against deeper Chinese targets unless petrol routes become riskier. A more credible deterrent against China would likely require large number of long-range SLBMs integrated into quieter boats capable of operating from a more secure bastion. A third limitation is force size. A very small SSBN fleet can contribute to deterrence. It constrains patrol continuity and survivability in prolonged crises. Maintenance, refit, training cycles reduce availability until India fields sign a sufficiently larger numbers of operational boats. Its ability to guarantee continuous at-sea deterrence may still be limited. A fourth issue is the command and control complexity. The public often celebrates platforms and ignores the command system behind them. But an SSBN requires secure, survivable, and authoritative communication under nuclear conditions. The state must ensure that submarines remain controllable without becoming vulnerable to decapitation or unauthorized use. This is among the most difficult aspects of sea-based deterrence, and public discussion rarely addresses it because it is inherently secret. Yet its importance is immense. The final limitation is that Arihant-Class is still transitional. It, it is a breakthrough, but not necessarily the end state required for stable parity against more advanced maritime nuclear powers. It solves some problems and postpones others. Full trajectory beyond Arihant. The future of India's sea-based deterrent likely lies beyond the Arihant class in larger and more capable designs, often referred to in open source as the S5 class. The future submarines are expected to feature greater displacement, more missile tubes, and compatibility with longer range SLBMs. If realized, they would significantly improve India's second strike posture, especially vis-a-vis China. But future designs will only matter if the underlying industrial, technological, and doctrinal ecosystem continues to mature. Bigger hulls alone do not create credible deterrence. India will need quieter propulsion and hull technologies, more robust command and control arrangements, secure basing and maintenance infrastructure, trained crews, and a reliable missile progression. It will also need a force sufficient to ensure meaningful at-sea availability. Thus, Arihant's long-term importance may lie less in its own peak capability and more in whether it successfully incubates the next generation. If it does, it will be remembered as the class that changed India's strategic destiny. If future growth stalls, Arihant will still remain historic but as an incomplete revolution rather than a finished system. Conclusion: The Arihant-class submarine is one of the clearest expression of India's strategic maturation in the post-independence era. It arose from historical insecurity, geopolitical lessons, and doctrinal necessity and technological ambition. It embodies the shift from symbolic nuclear status to more resilient nuclear posture. It gives India the sea-based leg of its nuclear triad and thereby strengthens the credibility of assured retaliation. It has deepened India's industrial and scientific competence in fields of exceptional strategic value. It has also exposed India's remaining limitations in stealth payload and long-range deterrence geometry. The class is therefore best understood neither as a flawless triumph nor as an overrated vanity project. It is something more important, a foundational capability. It marks the point at which India ceased being merely a land-based nuclear power with maritime ambitions and became a state with real, if still evolving, undersea strategic deterrent. The lead boats established the fact of capability, then enlarged boats improved the substance of that capability. The future classes will determine whether India can transform this foothold into a fully mature and continuously survivable sea-based deterrence. In the final analysis, the Arihant class matters because it changes the structure of Indian power. It pushes India deeper into the strategic logic of major states, while deterrence is measured not by rhetoric but by survival retaliatory capability. It reveals a state learning that the hardest lesson of nuclear politics, that the credibility of peace often rests on the hidden machinery of destruction. Beneath the sea, inside steel, reactor shielding, missile tubes, sonar rooms, and silent patrol routes. India has built not merely a submarine class but a new layer of sovereignty. Above all,